Her hands trembled so violently the letter nearly slipped from her fingers. 4 words were all he left her. I cannot do this. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty platform, 1 suitcase, and $4 standing between Clara Bennett and complete ruin. She pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from sobbing in front of strangers, her whole body shaking with the weight of being abandoned again. Then a shadow fell across her. A deep voice broke the silence, and a stranger she'd never met offered her the one thing she'd stopped believing existed: safety. She didn't know yet it would nearly get them both killed. Subscribe and drop your city below. The letter shook in Clara Bennett's hand so hard that the ink seemed to blur into the paper itself, as though even the words were ashamed to stay legible. I cannot do this. She read it again, and again, as if the 4th time might change what the first 3 had already made clear. The Dust Creek train platform had been loud only 20 minutes earlier. Dogs barking wagon wheels, grinding against packed dirt, men shouting prices for feed and nails. Now it was empty enough that Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could hear the specific humiliating silence of a woman who had been promised a life and given nothing instead. Ma'am. The station master, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained fingers, approached her with the practiced caution of someone who had seen this particular tragedy before. You need somewhere to wait. Someone coming for you. Clara straightened her spine. Some instinct buried deep from childhood refused to let strangers see her crumble. No, she said. No, thank you. I'm quite all right. The station master's eyes flicked to the letter in her hand, then to the small trunk beside her feet, then to the fading orange light beginning to stretch long shadows across the platform. He knew all right when he saw it, and this wasn't it. But he tipped his hat anyway and walked back toward his office, because some kindnesses were simply pretending not to notice. Clara waited until he was gone before she allowed herself one shaking breath. 3 months. 3 months of letters back and forth with Thomas Whitfield, a rancher who described himself as steady, honest, looking for a wife to share a quiet life in Wyoming territory. 3 months of Clara pouring her hopes into every response, describing herself carefully, hopefully, a woman raised without a real family, without real roots, searching for exactly the kind of steadiness he promised. 3 months, and he could not even find the courage to tell her in person. I cannot do this. No explanation. No apology beyond those 4 cowardly words scrawled and left with the depot clerk before he'd apparently fled town entirely, according to the same clerk who'd handed her the letter with an expression of pity that had made Clara's stomach twist. She picked up her trunk. It was heavier than it looked, not because of what was inside. A few dresses, some sewing supplies, a small collection of letters that had nothing to do with Thomas Whitfield at all, but because of what it represented. The last of everything Clara owned. The last of everything Clara was. She began walking. She did not know where. Dust Creek stretched out ahead of her, a modest frontier town of clapboard buildings and dirt roads, the kind of place that could swallow a stranger whole if that stranger had nowhere to go. Clara had exactly $4.30 in her coin purse, enough perhaps for 1 night's lodging and 1 more meal if she was careful. After that, she had no plan at all. You're gonna wear a hole in that road before you decide which direction you're walking, a voice said behind her. Clara spun around, nearly dropping her trunk. A man stood there tall enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly, holding the reins of a powerful black horse that shifted its weight with the same quiet patience its owner seemed to carry. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pushed back enough that she could see weathered lines around eyes that were studying her with an unreadable calm. I'm sorry, Clara said. You've been standing at that platform for near an hour, he said. Now you're walking in circles. Figured somebody ought to ask if you need help before you wander into the wilderness without knowing it. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't need help. I'm simply. Simply what? The question quiet, as it was cut straight through the false calm she was trying to hold together. Clara opened her mouth to answer, found nothing there, and closed it again. The stranger's expression didn't shift into pity, which she appreciated more than she expected to. It shifted instead into something steadier, something that looked almost like recognition. "Name's William Carter," he said. "I run a ranch about 4 miles outside town. Was in town today for supplies. Saw you standing there most of the afternoon, figured it wasn't my business until you started walking toward open land with a full trunk and no destination. Mr. Carter, I appreciate your concern, but—" "You don't have to explain," he said. "I'm not asking you to." Clara stared at him, caught somewhere between suspicion and an exhaustion so deep it made her knees feel weak. "Then what are you asking?" William looked at her for a long moment. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The horse shifted its weight again, huffing softly. "I'm not asking anything," he said finally. "I'm offering. You look like a woman who came a long way expecting something different than what she found. I've got a ranch that could use an extra pair of capable hands, and my housekeeper left 3 months back to care for her sick sister. I'm not offering charity, Miss—" "Bennett?" Clara said before she could stop herself. "Clara Bennett. Miss Bennett, I'm offering honest work. A roof, meals, fair wages, nothing more than that and nothing less." Clara laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You're offering employment to a stranger you found wandering a train platform." "I'm offering employment to a woman who doesn't look like she's had an easy road," William said. "Wyoming's full of hard stories, Miss Bennett. Doesn't mean the people carrying them aren't worth helping." Something in his voice, steady, unhurried, entirely without pity, made Clara's throat tighten unexpectedly. She thought of Thomas Whitfield's cowardly letter. She thought of every promise that had been made to her throughout her life, and broken just as easily. She thought of the $4.30 in her coin purse, and the growing darkness settling over Dust Creek. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me." William considered this, his jaw working slightly, as though weighing an answer carefully before releasing it. "Because 11 years ago," he said, "somebody helped me, when I had nothing left either. Didn't ask questions, didn't need explanations, just gave me a chance to prove I was worth the trouble." "And you're simply repeating the favor." "Something like that," he said, "though I suspect you're more capable than you're letting on, Miss Bennett. Woman traveling alone across half the territory doesn't strike me as someone looking for charity. Strikes me as someone who just needs a fair chance." Clara studied him carefully, the calm in his posture, the honesty in his eyes, the complete absence of the kind of predatory interest she had learned to recognize and fear in men who offered help to desperate women. "I have skills," she said, finally lifting her chin. "I can manage a household. I can cook, sew, keep accounts. I am not helpless, Mr. Carter, whatever I might look like standing here." "Didn't say you were helpless," William said. "Said you needed a fair chance. There's a difference." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight since she'd read those 4 cowardly words on the platform, loosening just slightly. "All right," she said before she could talk herself out of it. "All right, Mr. Carter. I accept your offer, temporarily." "Fair enough," William said, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Ranch is a 4-mile ride. You ever been on a horse before?" "I've ridden," Clara said, though not gracefully. "Nobody rides gracefully their first few months out here," William said, swinging up into the saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent his entire life on horseback. He extended a hand down toward her. "Come on, then. Best get moving before dark." Clara hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, allowing him to pull her up behind him onto the horse. As they rode out of Dust Creek, the last light of day stretching gold and orange across the endless grassland, Clara allowed herself for the first time in hours to breathe. She did not know this man. She did not know his ranch, his intentions, or what her life would look like tomorrow. But for the first time since reading that letter, she felt something other than despair. She felt cautiously something that might have been hope. The ranch house came into view just as the last light faded completely, a sturdy 2-story structure with lamplight glowing warm in the windows, surrounded by barns and corrals that spoke of careful, deliberate work. "Home," William said, simply dismounting and helping Clara down. An older woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron, squinting into the darkness. "William, who's that with you?" "Miss Clara Bennett," William said. "She's going to be helping around the house for a while. Clara, this is Martha. She cooks for the ranch hands and generally keeps this place from falling apart." Martha's sharp eyes moved over Clara with obvious appraisal, the travel-worn dress, the single trunk, the careful way Clara held herself, as though bracing for judgment. "Well," Martha said finally, "you look like you could use a hot meal and a warm bed more than you could use questions tonight. Come on, then." Clara followed her inside, aware of William's eyes on her back, aware of the strange, unmoored feeling of being somewhere entirely unfamiliar, with no way of knowing what tomorrow would bring. The house was simple, but well-kept wooden floors, worn smooth from years of use, a large kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a dining table long enough to seat a dozen ranch hands. Martha led her to a small room off the kitchen. "This'll be yours," Martha said. "Not much, but it's warm and it's dry. Bathroom's down the hall. I'll bring you something to eat." "Thank you," Clara said, and found she meant it more than the simple words conveyed. Martha paused at the door, studying her again. "You running from something, girl?" Clara's breath caught. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Martha said, not unkindly. "Half the people out here are running from something, just wondering if it's the kind of something that follows a person." Clara thought of the documents hidden carefully at the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in old newspaper tucked beneath a false bottom she'd constructed herself with trembling hands 3 weeks before she'd left home. "No," Clara said, and the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "Nothing like that." Martha studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly, though her eyes held a flicker of doubt. "All right then, get some rest. Ranch work starts early." That first night, Clara lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to sounds she didn't recognize, the wind moving through grass. She couldn't see the distant call of some night creature, the settling groans of a house built to withstand harsh winters. She thought of Thomas Whitfield's letter. She thought of the real reason she had answered his advertisement in the first place, not because she dreamed of marriage to a stranger, but because Wyoming territory was as far from home as she could reasonably travel without raising suspicion, and because a woman traveling to marry was far less conspicuous than a woman traveling to disappear. She thought of Jonathan Hale's face the last time she'd seen it. Calm, controlled, terrifyingly patient, the face of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make his threats understood. "You will regret whatever foolishness you're planning, Clara," he had told her, standing in her family's parlor, as though he already owned it, which, in a legal sense, he very nearly did. "Your father's debts are considerable. Your family's reputation depends entirely on my discretion. I would think carefully before doing anything you cannot undo." She had smiled at him. She had agreed sweetly. And 3 weeks later, she had vanished from her hometown, with a stolen ledger, forged property transfers, and enough evidence to destroy everything Jonathan Hale had built through fraud and intimidation, if she could ever find someone with the power to help her use it. She had told herself Wyoming territory would be far enough. She had told herself Thomas Whitfield's ranch would be safe enough. Now Thomas Whitfield was gone, and Clara Bennett was alone in a stranger's house, with nothing but her wits, her hidden evidence, and a fragile new safety she didn't yet trust. She closed her eyes and forced herself toward sleep, though sleep did not come easily. Morning arrived with the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee drifting beneath her door. Clara dressed quickly in her plainest dress and made her way to the kitchen, where Martha was already at work over the stove. "Sleep all right?" Martha asked without turning. "Well enough," Clara lied again. "Eat something. Then I'll show you the house, and William wants to talk with you about your duties before he heads out to check the herds." Clara ate the eggs and biscuits Martha provided, grateful for the simple, ordinary act of a hot meal, and found William waiting for her on the porch when she finished. "Sleep all right?" he asked, echoing Martha's question, and Clara wondered if the entire ranch simply assumed no one ever slept well their first night. "Well enough," she said again. William studied her for a moment. That same steady, unhurried attention she'd noticed the evening before, then nodded, apparently accepting her answer at face value, even if he suspected it wasn't entirely true. Martha will show you the house and explain the household duties, he said. Cooking for the hands, managing supplies, keeping the accounts straight, mending clothes when needed. It's honest work, but it's work. You understand that? I understand, Clara said. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Carter. William, he said. No need for such formality out here. William, Clara repeated, testing the name. I'll be out checking the herds most of the day, he continued. Ranch hands eat lunch around noon, supper around 6. Martha can explain the rest. If you need anything. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. If you need anything, you can ask. That's all I'm saying. Thank you, Clara said, and meant it. William nodded once, settled his hat lower against the morning sun, and headed toward the barn, leaving Clara standing on the porch with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in her chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had offered her help without demanding anything in return. She did not yet know whether to trust it. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Clara rose before dawn to help Martha prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, a rotating collection of a dozen men who worked William's considerable acreage, herding cattle, mending fences, breaking horses. She learned their names slowly. Pete, the oldest, hand-weathered and quiet, who'd worked for William's father before him. Jim and Daniel brothers, who bickered constantly but worked in perfect unspoken harmony. Young Tommy, barely 17, who blushed every time Clara spoke to him directly. She managed the household accounts, discovering quickly that Martha's arithmetic, while adequate, left considerable room for improvement, and within a week, Clara had reorganized the ranch's supply ledgers into a system that saved considerable money on unnecessary purchases. "Where'd you learn figures like that?" Martha asked one afternoon, studying Clara's careful columns with something between suspicion and admiration. "My father kept books for several businesses," Clara said carefully. Which was true, though it revealed nothing about why she herself had learned to keep books so precisely, or why that particular skill had become so essential to her survival. "Your father a merchant." "Something like that," Clara said, and changed the subject before Martha could ask further questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She mended torn work shirts with careful, even stitches. She learned to bake bread that rose properly, despite the ranch's temperamental oven. She discovered to her own surprise a genuine satisfaction in physical work, in seeing tasks completed, in watching hungry men eat meals she'd helped prepare, in the simple rhythm of a life built around effort rather than fear. But even as the days passed and Clara began to feel something like safety settling over her, she remained vigilant. She kept her trunk locked. She checked each night before sleep that the false bottom remained undisturbed. She startled at unfamiliar sounds, flinched when ranch hands raised their voices in ordinary disagreement, apologized reflexively whenever she needed anything at all, no matter how small. William noticed. He noticed the way Clara's shoulders tensed whenever Pete raised his voice, calling instructions across the yard, even when the instructions had nothing to do with her. He noticed the way she thanked Martha excessively for the smallest kindnesses, as though gratitude might somehow prevent those kindnesses from being withdrawn. He noticed the careful, controlled smile she wore, even when exhaustion was clearly written across her face. He said nothing about it directly, not at first. But 3 weeks into her employment, as autumn began cooling the Wyoming evenings, he found her sitting alone on the porch steps after the ranch hands had retired for the night, staring out at the darkened fields with an expression Clara clearly believed no one could see. "You always sit out here this late?" William asked, settling onto the steps beside her, though not too close. Clara startled slightly, quickly rearranging her expression into something more composed. "I find it peaceful. The quiet." William said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "You've been here 3 weeks now." "I have. Martha tells me you're the finest housekeeper this ranch has ever had. Says the accounts have never been so organized, says the hands have never eaten so well." "Martha is generous," Clara said, though a small, genuine smile touched her lips at the praise. "She's not generous," William said. "She's blunt as a hammer, and if she says something's good, it's because it's true." They sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch settling around them. Crickets, the distant lowing of cattle wind moving through grass. "Can I ask you something?" William said finally. Clara's posture stiffened slightly, though she kept her voice even. "You may ask." "Who hurt you?" The question landed with unexpected weight, and Clara felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly at the edges. "I don't understand," she said. "I think you do," William said gently. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you flinch at raised voices that have nothing to do with you. I've watched you apologize for existing practically whenever you need the smallest thing. I've watched you smile so carefully, like you're afraid someone might take it away if you smile wrong." Clara's eyes burned unexpectedly, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard against the sudden threat of tears. "I don't wish to discuss my past, Mr. Carter." "William," he corrected gently. "William." She repeated, her voice softer than she intended. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I'm not asking because I think I'm owed an explanation. I'm asking because I've noticed you carry yourself like someone waiting for the ground to disappear beneath you. And I'd like to understand why if you're willing to share it. And if you're not, that's all right too." Clara turned to look at him fully, then studying his face in the pale moonlight, the steady patience in his expression, the complete absence of demand or judgment. The quiet honesty that had characterized every interaction they'd had since that first evening at the depot. She thought of Jonathan Hale's cold, controlled voice. She thought of Thomas Whitfield's cowardly abandonment. She thought of every man in her life who had in one way or another taught her that kindness was rarely offered without eventual cost. She thought, too, of the careful way William Carter had offered her employment without demanding gratitude, had offered her safety without demanding explanation, had offered her in 3 short weeks more genuine respect than she had experienced in years. "There was a marriage arranged for me," Clara said slowly, choosing her words with extreme care. "Before I answered Thomas Whitfield's advertisement. A business arrangement more than a marriage. A man my family owed considerable debts to." William's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted a subtle attentiveness, as though every word mattered more than Clara understood. "I refused," Clara continued. "And the refusal had consequences I'm not prepared to discuss in detail. I left my hometown rather than accept what was being demanded of me. Thomas Whitfield's advertisement seemed like the safest way to disappear without raising suspicion. And now Thomas Whitfield is gone too," William said quietly. "Yes. Are you in danger, Clara?" The question hung in the night air between them, and Clara felt the weight of every secret she carried pressing against her chest. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope not. I hope I traveled far enough that it won't matter anymore." William studied her for a long moment, and Clara braced herself for questions she wasn't prepared to answer for suspicion, for the kind of probing interrogation she'd learned to fear from men who sensed weakness and moved to exploit it. Instead, William simply nodded. "All right," he said. "Then you're safe here as long as you need to be. Whatever it takes." "You don't even know the full truth," Clara said, startled by the simplicity of his acceptance. "I know enough," William said. "I know you're a hard-working, capable woman who's carrying something heavy enough to make her flinch at raised voices. That's all I need to know tonight. The rest you'll tell me when you're ready, if you're ever ready at all." Clara felt something break loose in her chest, not quite tears, but something adjacent to them. Some tightly wound tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since long before Thomas Whitfield's cowardly letter, since long before Jonathan Hale's cold threats, since childhood itself, perhaps when she'd first learned that adults who promised safety rarely delivered it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for," William said, rising from the steps. "Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow's another early morning." He left her alone on the porch, and Clara sat for a long while afterward, staring out at the darkened fields, feeling something unfamiliar settling over her. For the first time since she'd fled her hometown, with stolen evidence hidden in a false bottom trunk, she felt something that might have been the beginning of trust. She did not yet know how dangerous that feeling would prove to be. The weeks that followed brought a gradual, cautious warmth between them. William began seeking Clara out in small ways, asking her opinion on household matters, sharing details about ranch operations, occasionally riding alongside her when she walked to check on the chicken coop or the garden Martha insisted on maintaining despite the difficult Wyoming soil. Clara found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, beginning to relax in his presence. She laughed genuinely for the first time in months when Tommy accidentally released an entire pen of chickens into the yard and spent 20 frantic minutes chasing them, while the older ranch hands howled with laughter. She felt real pride when William praised her reorganization of the ranch's financial records. She felt something warmer and more complicated than pride when she caught him watching her across the dinner table, his expression thoughtful in a way she couldn't quite decipher. But even as trust grew, vigilance remained. Clara continued checking her trunk each night. She continued listening carefully to any mention of visitors passing through Dust Creek, any strangers asking questions about newcomers to the territory. She continued rehearsing in the quiet moments before sleep exactly what she would say if Jonathan Hale's associates ever found her. She hoped desperately that they never would. 6 weeks after her arrival, that hope began to crumble.
Jarab.
It started with Pete, the oldest ranch hand, mentioning almost casually over breakfast that a stranger had been asking questions in Dust Creek.
Fella at the general store,
Pete said, spreading butter thick across a biscuit.
Well-dressed sort, not from around here. Asking Miller about any new folks who'd come through town recent.
Miller says he described a woman traveling alone, dark hair, educated way of speaking. Clara's hands went still over the dishes she was washing, though she forced herself to continue the motion after only a fraction of a second's hesitation. Did Miller tell him anything? William asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Clara caught the quick glance he shot in her direction. Miller doesn't know much to tell, Pete said. Said the stranger seemed awful particular about it, though. Not the kind of curiosity that comes from casual interest. What did he look like? Clara asked, and was grateful her voice remained steady, despite the sudden pounding of her heart. Pete shrugged. Miller said tall, dark hair going gray at the temple's expensive coat. Talked like a city man. Why, you know somebody matching that description. No, Clara said quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, because she saw Pete's eyebrows lift slightly with curiosity before he returned his attention to his breakfast. But William was watching her now, with an expression she recognized immediately, the same careful attention from their conversation on the porch. Weeks earlier, the same unspoken question hanging between them. That evening, after the ranch hands had dispersed to their evening chores, William found Clara in the kitchen alone, staring at nothing in particular. "Tell me," he said simply. Clara didn't pretend not to understand. "It could be him, Jonathan Hale, or someone he sent. The man your family owed debts to." "Yes. What exactly does he want from you, Clara?" William's voice remained gentle, but there was an edge of seriousness beneath it, now the tone of a man preparing to defend something important. Clara closed her eyes briefly, weighing every consequence of the truth against every consequence of continued silence. "Before I left," she said finally, "I discovered evidence that Jonathan Hale had been systematically defrauding my family and several other families in our community. Forged property documents, manipulated inheritance records, threatened witnesses into silence. I took proof of his crimes before I fled, documents I've kept hidden ever since." William's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "That's why you flinch at raised voices. That's why you check your trunk every night." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things about you, Clara," William said quietly, and something in his tone made her breath catch unexpectedly. "You're not as subtle as you believe yourself to be." "If he finds me," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. "If he finds the evidence I'm carrying, I don't know what he'll do. He's powerful. He has friends in positions that could make any accusation I raise seem like the ravings of an unstable woman." "He won't find you," William said firmly. "Not while you're under my protection. You don't understand what you'd be risking, Clara said. Jonathan Hale doesn't simply give up when he encounters obstacles. He removes them. I've dealt with dangerous men before, Clara, William said. I didn't build this ranch by backing down from threats. This isn't the same, Clara insisted. This is, Clara. William's voice was quiet, but absolutely certain, cutting through her rising panic. I'm not asking you to explain the danger to me as though I don't understand consequence. I'm telling you that whatever happens, you're not facing it alone. Not anymore. Clara stared at him, this steady, quiet man who had offered her safety without demand from the very first evening they'd met, who had asked nothing of her, except honesty, when she was finally ready to offer it, who now stood prepared to defend her against a threat he barely understood. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything you've built for a stranger you've known less than 2 months? William was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working slightly, as though weighing words carefully before releasing them. Because you're not a stranger anymore, Clara, he said finally, and because some things are worth risking everything to protect. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared to acknowledge directly. William, Clara began, though she wasn't certain what she intended to say. Get some sleep, he said instead, stepping back slightly, as though suddenly aware of how close the conversation had drifted toward territory neither of them was ready to name. We'll figure out what to do about this stranger asking questions, together. He left the kitchen before Clara could respond, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that she was no longer facing Jonathan Hale's threat entirely alone. But somewhere in Dust Creek, a well-dressed stranger was asking careful questions about a woman traveling alone. And Clara understood with sickening certainty that whoever he was, he would eventually find his way to William Carter's ranch. The only question remaining was how much time she had left before that happened, and whether the fragile safety she'd found here would survive whatever came next. The stranger's name was Edmund Cross, and he arrived at the Carter Ranch 4 days later on a bay horse, far too clean for a man who claimed to be simply passing through. Clara saw him first from the kitchen window, the careful way he sat his horse, the expensive cut of his coat, the deliberate manner in which his eyes swept across the property before he ever dismounted. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. William! Her voice came out strangled. William was at her side in seconds, following her gaze out the window. His jaw tightened. Stay inside, he said quietly. Let me handle this. You don't understand who Clara. His hand found her shoulder steady and firm. Stay inside. She watched from behind the curtain as William walked out to meet the stranger. Pete and 2 other ranch hands drifting casually toward the yard, close enough to matter, far enough to seem incidental. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought she might be sick. Afternoon? William called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Help you with something. The stranger dismounted slowly, removing his hat with theatrical politeness. Edmund Cross. I'm making inquiries on behalf of a business associate, looking for a young woman who may have passed through this area recently. Dark hair, educated speech, possibly traveling under an assumed name. Lot of women travel through this territory, William said. Descriptions not much to go on. This particular woman. Cross continued, his tone smooth as poured oil, left behind a considerable debt to my associate. A misunderstanding, nothing criminal, simply a matter of settling accounts. My associate is eager to resolve things quietly without involving authorities. Clara's fingers dug into the windowsill. Don't know anybody matching that description, William said. Cross smiled, though the expression never touched his eyes. You run this ranch alone, Mr. Carter. I've got hands and a housekeeper. Something shifted in Cross's expression, subtle, calculating. A housekeeper. How long has she been in your employ? Clara stopped breathing entirely. Long enough that it's none of your business. William said, his voice hardening just slightly enough to make Pete straighten beside him. Cross studied William for a long moment, and Clara could see him recalculating, adjusting his approach like a man rearranging pieces on a chessboard. "Of course," Cross said finally. "My apologies for the intrusion, Mr. Carter. Should you happen to encounter a woman matching the description I've given, dark hair, educated, likely calling herself something other than her given name, my associate would be extremely grateful for any information." "Extremely grateful and extremely generous. I'll keep that in mind," William said flatly. Cross remounted his horse with unhurried precision, then paused, looking directly toward the house, directly Clara was certain at the window where she stood frozen. "Lovely property, Mr. Carter," Cross said. "I imagine it would be a shame if complications arose from harboring someone else's property. Legal complications can become remarkably expensive." "Is that a threat?" William asked, his voice gone dangerously quiet. "A simple observation," Cross said, smiling that same cold, empty smile. "Good day, Mr. Carter." He rode away at an unhurried pace, and Clara didn't move from the window until his silhouette had completely disappeared over the ridge. William came inside moments later, his expression thunderous. "He knows," Clara whispered, before William could speak. "He looked directly at this window, William. He knows I'm here." "He suspects," William corrected. "There's a difference. Not enough of one." Clara's hands were shaking now, the careful composure she'd maintained for 6 weeks, finally beginning to crack. "I need to leave. Tonight. If he tells Jonathan I'm here, you're not leaving." "William, you don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand exactly what he's capable of," William said, his voice sharp enough that Clara startled. "I understand he just stood in my yard and threatened my property, my livelihood, and the safety of someone I—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. "Someone you— what?" Clara asked quietly. William looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his eyes, before he mastered it back into careful control. "Someone who matters," he said finally. "That's what I understand, and I'm not letting some smug city lawyer chase you off my land with veiled threats." "He's not a lawyer," Clara said. "He's worse. He's the kind of man Jonathan hires when he needs something done that can't leave fingerprints." "Then we need to be smarter than him," William said, "not more frightened." Clara wanted desperately to believe that was possible. That night, sleep proved entirely impossible. Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to every creak of the house, every distant sound carried on the Wyoming wind, certain each one signaled Jonathan Hale's men closing in around the ranch. She finally gave up near midnight, pulling on a shawl and making her way to the kitchen for water, only to find William already there, sitting at the long table, with a lamp burning low, a rifle laid across the surface in front of him. "You should be sleeping," Clara said. "Same could be said of you." She sat across from him, studying the rifle with a mixture of comfort and fear. "You really think he'll come back?" "I think men like Edmund Cross don't waste trips," William said. "He came to confirm a suspicion. Now he'll report back to whoever sent him, and then we'll see what happens next." "What if it's not enough time?" Clara's voice trembled despite her best efforts. "What if Jonathan comes here himself? Then he'll find out real quick that Wyoming territory doesn't work the same way as wherever you came from," William said. "Money and influence don't mean as much out here as they do back east. Men respect strength and fairness more than titles." "Jonathan doesn't understand fairness," Clara said. "He understands leverage and control and making people disappear when they become inconvenient." William's expression darkened. "Has he hurt people before directly?" Clara hesitated, memories rising unbidden, a bookkeeper who had questioned certain transactions and vanished from town within a week, a young clerk who had threatened to go to authorities and was found beaten nearly to death in an alley, dismissed by local police as an unfortunate robbery. "Yes," she whispered. "People who got in his way." William's jaw tightened, his hand moving unconsciously to rest against the rifle. "Then we make certain you never become that kind of inconvenience to him. We make certain the evidence you're carrying reaches someone powerful enough to protect you before he ever gets the chance." Who? Clara asked. Who out here has that kind of power? William was quiet for a moment, considering. Judge Harrison Whitmore, circuit judge for this territory. Comes through Dust Creek every few months to hear cases. Man's got a reputation for being incorruptible, turned down bribes from railroad companies twice that I know of personally. If we can get your evidence in front of him before Jonathan's men reach us, we might have a real chance. When does he come through next? 3 weeks, William said. Maybe less if we send word requesting an earlier hearing. 3 weeks felt like an eternity, with Edmund Cross's cold smile still burning in Clara's memory. That's too long, she said. William, if Jonathan learns where I am before then we protect you until Judge Whitmore arrives, William said firmly. That's all there is to it. Clara studied him in the lamplight, the exhaustion evident beneath his steady composure, the genuine determination in his expression, the complete absence of hesitation, despite the very real danger he was choosing to accept on her behalf. You keep saying, we, she said softly. This isn't your fight, William. It became my fight the moment Edmund Cross stood in my yard and threatened what's mine. William said, then seemed to catch himself, a flush rising along his jaw. What's under my protection? The correction hung awkwardly between them, and Clara felt her own cheeks warm, despite the fear still coursing through her veins. William. Get some sleep, Clara, he said, rising abruptly. Whatever's coming, we'll face it better rested than exhausted. He left her alone in the kitchen, and Clara sat for a long while afterward, turning over his words, his near confession, the complicated warmth spreading through her chest, even as terror gripped her equally hard. She did not sleep well that night, but for the first time since Edmund Cross's visit, she allowed herself a small measure of hope that she might survive whatever came next. The following days brought a tense, watchful rhythm to the ranch. William doubled the night watch, rotating ranch hands through overnight shifts covering the property's perimeter. Pete began carrying his rifle, even during routine chores. Martha, upon learning the full danger Clara faced, insisted on keeping a loaded shotgun within reach in the kitchen at all times. Should have told me sooner, girl, Martha said, though her tone held no real anger, only fierce protectiveness. I've buried a husband and raised 3 sons in this territory. I know how to handle trouble when it comes. I didn't want to put anyone else at risk, Clara said. Too late for that now. Martha said, checking the shotgun's chamber with practiced efficiency. You're part of this ranch now, whether you meant to be or not, and nobody threatens what's ours without answering for it. The words settled something in Clara's chest, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of belonging she hadn't dared hope for since fleeing her hometown months earlier. But even as the ranch rallied around her, Clara couldn't shake the growing dread that Edmund Cross's report would bring Jonathan Hale's full attention down upon them all. That dread proved justified 6 days later. Tommy came racing into the yard on his horse, nearly falling from the saddle in his haste to dismount. Riders coming, he shouted. 4 of them, maybe 5. Coming up the main road, moving fast. William was already moving, shouting instructions to the hands scattered across the property. Pete, Jim, get to the house. Daniel, watch the barn. Clara. I'm not hiding, Clara said, before he could finish the sentence, her voice steadier than she felt. Clara, this isn't the time to... If Jonathan sent men, I need to see who they are, she said. I need to know what we're facing. William's expression warred between frustration and reluctant respect. Stay behind me. Whatever happens, stay behind me. The riders arrived in a cloud of dust, and Clara's heart seized when she recognized the lead rider, not Edmund Cross, but someone far more dangerous. Jonathan Hale himself. He dismounted with the same controlled, deliberate grace Clara remembered from countless encounters in her family's parlor. His expensive coat unmarked by the long journey. His expression calm in a way that had always terrified her more than open anger ever could. Clara, he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, as though greeting an old friend rather than a woman he'd threatened and manipulated for months. You've led me quite a chase. Jonathan! Clara forced her voice steady, though every instinct screamed at her to run. You look well. Jonathan continued, his eyes sweeping over her with clinical assessment. Rural life apparently agrees with you, though I confess I'm disappointed. I'd hoped you might have come to your senses by now. This is private property, William said, stepping forward, his voice carrying an edge Clara hadn't heard from him before. I'll ask you to state your business and then leave. Jonathan's attention shifted to William with the same calculating assessment. You must be the rancher Edmund mentioned. Carter, was it? I appreciate you providing shelter for Miss Bennet, though I'm afraid her situation is rather more complicated than she's likely represented. She's told me everything I need to know, William said. Has she? Jonathan's smile widened slightly. Did she mention the considerable debt her family owes me? Did she mention the property documents she stole before fleeing, documents that, I might add, constitute theft under any reasonable interpretation of law? Documents that prove your fraud, Clara said sharply, her fear giving way suddenly to fury. Documents that prove you forged property transfers and manipulated my family's inheritance. Jonathan's expression didn't waver, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. Serious accusations, Clara. Accusations that would require considerable evidence to substantiate. Evidence that conveniently you claim to possess, but have shown no one. I'll show Judge Whitmore, Clara said. He arrives in 3 weeks. Something shifted in Jonathan's expression, brief, almost imperceptible, but Clara caught it. Concern. Judge Whitmore has quite a reputation, Jonathan said carefully. Though I wonder if he'll find your story as compelling as you imagine. A young woman fleeing an arranged marriage, carrying stolen documents, making wild accusations against a respected businessman. I imagine reasonable people might question your credibility rather more than mine. Reasonable people examine evidence, Clara said. Not reputations. We're done here. William interjected, stepping between Clara and Jonathan with deliberate finality. You've said your piece. Now leave my property. Jonathan's gaze shifted to William, calculating dangerous. You're making a significant mistake, Mr. Carter, involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. She's under my protection, William said. That makes it concern me plenty. Protection. Jonathan repeated, something almost amused in his tone. How chivalrous. Though I wonder how far your protection extends when faced with legal complications. Property liens, perhaps. Accusations of harboring a fugitive. Wyoming Territories courts, I'm told, take property disputes rather seriously. Try it, William said, his voice gone dangerously quiet. See how far your influence extends out here compared to wherever you're used to operating. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down, tension crackling through the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Clara held her breath, terrified of what might happen next. Finally, Jonathan smiled, cold, calculated, entirely unconvinced. Very well, he said. I'll leave you to your rural idyll for now, Mr. Carter. But Clara, his attention shifted back to her. Do consider carefully what you're risking, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. I have considerable resources at my disposal, resources that extend far beyond simple legal maneuvering. Is that a threat? William asked. A simple observation, Jonathan said, echoing Edmund Cross's earlier words with deliberate precision, as though wanting Clara to understand the connection. Good day, Mr. Carter. Clara. He remounted with unhurried grace, his men following suit, and rode away without another word, leaving a heavy, dangerous silence in his wake. Clara's knees nearly buckled the moment he disappeared over the ridge, and William caught her elbow, steadying her. He'll be back, Clara whispered. He won't simply give up. I know, William said grimly. Which means we need Judge Whitmore here sooner than 3 weeks. Tonight I'm sending Pete to ride ahead and request an emergency hearing. Will that work? It has to, William said, because I don't think Jonathan Hale is the kind of man who waits patiently for justice to catch up with him. Clara looked up at him, fear and gratitude and something warmer, more complicated tangled together in her chest. Thank you for standing between us, for not backing down. Wasn't a difficult choice, William said quietly. Not when it comes to you. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to name directly, before William cleared his throat and turned toward the house, calling instructions to the ranch hands, still watching from a cautious distance. But Clara remained standing in the yard a moment longer, staring at the ridge where Jonathan Hale had disappeared, dread pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. She had seen that expression on his face before, the calm, controlled fury of a man recalculating his approach, preparing his next move with the patient precision of a predator who had merely been delayed, not defeated. Whatever came next, Clara understood with sickening certainty that Jonathan Hale would not simply walk away. Pete left for Cheyenne before dawn the next morning, carrying William's urgent request for Judge Whitmore's earliest possible arrival. The ranch settled into a tense, watchful waiting, every distant sound on the horizon triggering fresh anxiety, every unfamiliar rider approaching the property, drawing immediate careful attention from the remaining hands. 3 days passed with unbearable slowness. On the 4th day, disaster arrived in a form Clara hadn't anticipated. She was in the kitchen helping Martha prepare the midday meal when Daniel burst through the door, his face pale with alarm. "Fire!" he shouted. "The east pasture! Someone set fire to the east pasture fence line!" William was outside within seconds, and Clara followed close behind, watching in horror as flames licked hungrily along the wooden fence separating the ranch's eastern grazing land from open prairie smoke, billowing dark against the afternoon sky. "Get the water barrels," William shouted, already moving toward the blaze. "Jim, round up the cattle before they scatter Tommy. Ring the bell, we need every hand out here." Chaos erupted across the property ranch, hands racing toward the fire with buckets and shovels, cattle bellowing in panic as smoke rolled across the pasture, the acrid smell of burning wood thick in the air. Clara grabbed a bucket and joined the line forming between the water pump and the fence line, passing water hand to hand with desperate urgency as the flames threatened to spread toward the barn. "This wasn't an accident," William said grimly, his face streaked with soot as he directed the firefighting efforts. "Fence line doesn't catch fire on its own in the middle of a calm afternoon." "Jonathan," Clara said, understanding dawning with cold, sick certainty. "Or someone he sent," William confirmed. "Sending a message, reminding us how easily he can reach us if he chooses to." The fire took nearly 2 hours to fully extinguish, leaving a considerable stretch of fence line destroyed, and everyone exhausted, coughing, blackened with smoke and ash. "Anyone hurt?" William called out, moving through the scattered hands, checking each one carefully. "Just tired and smoky," Pete said, though he'd returned from Cheyenne only that morning, exhausted from his journey and now further exhausted from firefighting. "Judge Whitmore's agreed to an emergency hearing, by the way. Says he can be here in 5 days given the circumstances I described." "5 days," Clara repeated, relief and terror tangling together in her chest. "Can we survive 5 days if Jonathan escalates further?" "We'll have to," William said grimly, surveying the damaged fence line with barely controlled fury. "Because I'm not letting him chase us into hiding, and I'm not letting him destroy everything I've built out of pure spite." That night, exhausted and shaken, the entire ranch gathered for a late supper, the mood somber despite Martha's best efforts at normalcy. "We need additional protection," William said, finally addressing the assembled hands. "Starting tonight, I want 2 men on watch at all times, rotating every 4 hours. Anyone approaching this property who isn't recognized gets challenged immediately." "And if they don't stop?" Jim asked. "Then we defend what's ours," William said simply. "All of it, including Clara." The hands nodded grimly, understanding the gravity of what they were agreeing to defend. Later, after the hands had dispersed to their assigned watches, Clara found William alone on the porch, staring out at the darkened, damaged fence line, still visible in the moonlight. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "Everything you're risking, everything your men are risking." "Stop," William said firmly, turning to face her. "This isn't your fault, Clara. This is Jonathan Hale's fault for being a fraudulent, vindictive man who can't accept that his crimes have finally caught up with him. But if I hadn't come here, then you'd be facing him entirely alone," William said. And I don't believe for a moment that outcome would be better for anyone, least of all you." Clara studied him in the pale moonlight, exhaustion and fear, and something fiercely protective all warring across his features. "Why do you care so much?" she asked softly. "You barely knew me 2 months ago." William was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though weighing words carefully. "Because somewhere in these past 2 months," he said finally, "you stopped being a stranger. I found wandering a train platform, and started being someone whose safety matters more to me than almost anything else in my life. I don't fully understand how it happened. I just know it's true." Clara's breath caught her heart pounding with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. "William, I know it's complicated," he continued before she could finish. "I know you've got evidence to protect and a dangerous man hunting you, and probably no room in your life right now for anything beyond survival. I'm not asking for anything, Clara. I just needed you to know the truth of it." Clara stared at him, this steady, honorable man who had offered her safety without demand from their very first meeting, who now stood ready to risk everything. His ranch, his men, his own safety to protect her from a threat that had nothing to do with him beyond his own choice to make it his concern. "I'm frightened," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Not just of Jonathan. Of this. Of what I'm starting to feel when I have no right to feel anything beyond survival right now." "Then we'll be frightened together," William said quietly. "And we'll survive this together too, whatever it takes." He reached out his hand, finding hers in the darkness, and Clara let him hold it, drawing strength from the simple, steady warmth of his touch. "5 days," she whispered. "Can we survive 5 days?" "We'll have to," William said. "Because I'm not losing you now, not after everything." They stood together in the darkness, hands clasped, watching the damaged fence line, and the dangerous unknown stretching ahead of them, both aware that Jonathan Hale's next move might prove far more devastating than a burned fence line. Neither of them could have anticipated exactly how devastating that next move would be, or how close they would come to losing everything before Judge Whitmore ever arrived to hear Clara's case. Somewhere beyond the ridge in the darkness of the Wyoming night, Jonathan Hale was already planning his next attack, one that would strike not at the ranch's property, but at its people. And this time the target wouldn't be Clara at all. The scream came just before dawn. Clara bolted upright in bed, heart slamming against her ribs, before she even fully registered the sound, Martha's voice, raw with terror, coming from somewhere near the barn. She threw on her shawl and ran bare feet, slapping against the cold floorboards through the kitchen and out into gray morning light, where a scene of chaos was already unfolding. Tommy lay on the ground, blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder, Martha kneeling beside him, pressing a cloth hard against the wound while he groaned through gritted teeth. "What happened?" Clara's voice came out strangled. "2 men," Martha said, not looking up, her hand steady, despite the blood soaking through her fingers. "Came through the tree line before light. Tommy was on watch, saw them, shouted a warning before they shot him and ran." William arrived at a dead-run rifle, already in hand, his face draining of color at the sight of Tommy's blood. "How bad?" "Shoulder wound," Martha said. "Bullet's still in there. He needs a doctor, and he needs one now." "Jim, saddle up, ride for Doc Reeves in town," William barked. "Daniel, Pete, sweep the perimeter. I want to know if those men are still on the property." The ranch hands scattered into motion, and Clara dropped to her knees beside Tommy, taking his hand as he writhed in pain. "You're going to be all right," she said, though her voice shook with the lie's uncertainty. "You're going to be just fine. Miss Clara." Tommy gasped, sweat beading across his young face. "I tried to stop them. I shouted like Mr. Carter said. I didn't run." "I know," Clara said, tears burning behind her eyes. "I know you didn't. You did exactly right." William crouched on Tommy's other side, his expression carved from granite. "Which direction did they come from? Tommy, can you tell me anything about them?" "2 riders," Tommy managed. "Heard one call the other Grant. Said something about finishing the job before the judge arrives." Clara's blood went cold. William's jaw tightened to the point of visible strain. "They know about the hearing." "Someone told them," Clara whispered. Jonathan has people everywhere. He must have learned Pete rode for Cheyenne.
Doesn't matter how he knows, William said. What matters is he's escalating faster than we anticipated. This wasn't a warning like the fence fire. This was an attempt to hurt someone He stopped abruptly, glancing at Tommy's pained face, before finishing more carefully. Someone under my care. Martha looked up sharply. You think they meant to kill the boy? I think they meant to send a message loud enough that we'd understand exactly what Jonathan Hale is capable of, William said grimly. And I think if Tommy hadn't shouted a warning, they might have gotten considerably closer to the house before anyone noticed them at all. The implication hung heavy and terrifying in the cold morning air. Clara felt sick, understanding with sudden sharp clarity that the danger surrounding her had just transformed from threat into open violence. Jim returned with Doc Reeves within the hour, and Clara watched helpless and heartsick as the elderly doctor worked to extract the bullet from Tommy's shoulder, the young man's face pale and sweating despite Martha's steady, comforting presence at his side. He'll live, Doc Reeves said, finally wiping blood from his hands. Clean wound bullet didn't hit anything vital. But he needs rest, and he needs to avoid strain on that shoulder for several weeks. Relief flooded through Clara so intensely, her knees nearly buckled. Thank you, she whispered. William pulled Doc Reeves aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Clara couldn't quite hear, though she caught fragments. Attempted murder. Need you to report this to the sheriff. Evidence for Judge Whitmore's hearing. Doc Reeves nodded grimly, gathering his supplies. I'll speak with Sheriff Morrison directly. This kind of violence needs official documentation before your hearing, no question about it. After the doctor departed, William found Clara sitting beside Tommy's bed, watching him sleep fitfully under the effects of laudanum Doc Reeves had administered for the pain. This is escalating faster than we can control, William said quietly. Judge Whitmore's still 3 days out. I don't know if we can guarantee everyone's safety until then. Then we need to bring the hearing forward, Clara said, or find another way to get the evidence into official hands before Jonathan can attempt something worse than what happened to Tommy. What are you suggesting? Clara considered carefully, her mind racing through possibilities born of desperation. Sheriff Morrison? If Doc Reeves reports the shooting, the sheriff will need to investigate regardless of the upcoming hearing. If I present my evidence to him directly, official documentation exists, even if something happens to prevent the hearing itself. That's smart. William said, something like admiration flickering across his exhausted features. Redundancy. Multiple paths to justice, so Jonathan can't simply eliminate one obstacle and consider the threat resolved. I learned from watching Jonathan operate for years, Clara said bitterly. He always has multiple paths to his goals. I should have learned that lesson sooner myself. You're learning it now, William said. That's what matters. They rode into Dust Creek together that afternoon. Clara's trunk carefully secured the false bottom, finally about to be revealed, after months of careful concealment. Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s with sharp assessing eyes, listened to their account of the shooting with grim attention before turning his focus to Clara's evidence. Show me, he said simply. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the trunk, carefully prying loose the false bottom she'd constructed with such desperate care months earlier, revealing the carefully preserved documents beneath forged property transfers, bearing Jonathan's distinctive handwriting ledgers, showing systematic embezzlement from her family's estate letters between Jonathan and corrupt officials, arranging the suppression of witness testimony. Sheriff Morrison examined each document with increasing seriousness, his expression darkening progressively as the scope of Jonathan's fraud became clear. This is considerable evidence, he said finally. Enough to warrant serious criminal charges, assuming its authenticity can be verified. It's authentic, Clara said firmly. Every document, every signature. I compiled this evidence over nearly a year at considerable personal risk. And this Jonathan Hale, he's the one who arranged the shooting this morning. We believe so, William said. Man matching his associate's description was seen asking questions in town last week. Then a fence line burned. Now a boy's been shot. The pattern's clear enough. Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly, gathering the documents with careful precision. I'll take official custody of this evidence, have my deputy make copies for safekeeping in multiple locations. I'll also send word to Judge Whitmore about the shooting, might convince him to expedite matters further, given the escalating violence. Thank you, Sheriff, Clara said, relief washing through her despite the exhaustion weighing on every limb. Don't thank me yet, Sheriff Morrison said grimly. Men like this Jonathan Hale don't simply accept defeat gracefully. If he learns evidence has reached official hands, he may escalate further, still trying to eliminate witnesses or destroy remaining evidence before it can be used against him. The warning settled cold and heavy in Clara's stomach as they rode back toward the ranch, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the prairie. He's right, Clara said. Jonathan won't simply give up now? Then we prepare for whatever comes next, William said. Together. That night brought no rest for anyone at the Carter Ranch. William doubled the watch again, positioning armed hands at strategic points around the property's perimeter. Clara found herself unable to sleep, pacing her small room until finally giving up entirely and making her way to the kitchen for the second time that week, finding William once again keeping vigil with his rifle close at hand. "You should sleep," she said, echoing his own words back at him. "Can't," he admitted. "Too much at stake tonight." Clara sat across from him, studying his exhausted, determined features in the lamplight. "I keep thinking about Tommy, about how close it came to being so much worse." "He's young and strong," William said. "He'll heal. But you're right to be frightened, Clara. This is real now in a way it wasn't before. Real violence, real danger, not just threats and intimidation. I never should have let it reach this point," Clara said, guilt crushing down on her chest. "I should have found another way to expose Jonathan, without endangering everyone around me." "There was no other way," William said firmly. "Men like Jonathan Hale don't respond to reason or appeals to conscience. They only respond to consequences severe enough to threaten their own position. You did what needed doing, Clara. The violence isn't your fault. It's his for choosing to escalate rather than accept accountability." "You keep saying that," Clara said softly. "That none of this is my fault. I'm not certain I believe you yet." "Then I'll keep saying it until you do," William said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Because it's true whether you believe it yet or not." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. Exhaustion and fear and gratitude tangling together until she could barely distinguish between them. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've risked. Your ranch, your men. Tommy's nearly died protecting me." "Tommy protected this ranch," William corrected gently. "Which happens to include you now, whether either of us fully anticipated that outcome 2 months ago." "William," Clara's voice broke slightly, "if something happens to you because of me—" "Nothing's going to happen to me," William said firmly. "We're going to get through this. Judge Whitmore arrives in 3 days. Sheriff Morrison has your evidence secured. We simply need to survive that long, and then Jonathan Hale's entire scheme collapses under the weight of his own crimes." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," William admitted. "But it's possible. And I intend to make certain we reach the other side of this together." Clara studied him in the dim lamplight. This steady, honorable man who had transformed from stranger to protector to something far more complicated and precious in the span of 2 short months. "William," she said softly, "whatever happens, I need you to know these past 2 months, despite everything, despite the fear and danger, have been the first time in my adult life I've felt something like genuine safety. Genuine belonging. That's because of you." William's expression softened, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his careful composure. "Clara, The sound of gunfire shattered the moment. Both of them were on their feet instantly. William grabbing his rifle, Clara's heart hammering with sudden violent terror. "Stay here!" William shouted, already moving toward the door. "William!" "Stay here!" "Clara, lock the door behind me." He disappeared into the darkness, and Clara stood frozen for a single terrified moment before rushing to bolt the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely manage the simple task. Outside, chaos erupted, shouted commands.
More gunfire, the panicked whinnying of horses. Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the window, peering carefully into the darkness, trying to discern what was happening. She could see shapes moving near the barn. Pete and Daniel exchanging gunfire, with figures emerging from the tree line, William's voice shouting instructions somewhere in the chaos. The gunfire seemed to last an eternity, though it likely spanned only a few terrifying minutes before finally falling silent, leaving only the distant sound of retreating hoofbeats and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. Clara waited, frozen with terror, until she heard William's voice calling her name from just outside the door. "Clara, it's me. Open the door." She fumbled with the bolt, throwing the door open to find William standing there, disheveled, breathing hard, but apparently unharmed. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, her hands moving over him frantically, checking for injury despite his evident intact condition. "I'm fine," William said. Pete took a graze to the arm, nothing serious. But Clara? His expression turned grim. They weren't trying to breach the house this time. They were trying to reach the barn. "Why the barn?" "Because that's where we keep the ranch's financial records," William said. "Records that would prove this ranch has been operating legitimately for over a decade. Records that would help establish my credibility as a witness when I testify on your behalf before Judge Whitmore." Clara's blood ran cold with sudden understanding. "He's trying to discredit you, destroy any evidence that might support my testimony." "Seems that way," William confirmed, "which means Judge Whitmore's arrival can't come soon enough." They stood together in the doorway, adrenaline and fear, and something fiercely protective coursing through both of them, painfully aware that Jonathan Hale's escalating violence showed no signs of slowing before the crucial hearing that would determine Clara's entire future. 2 days, Clara whispered. "Can we survive 2 more days?" "We have to," William said, pulling her into a fierce protective embrace that Clara sank into, without hesitation, craving the solid warmth of his presence against the terror still coursing through her veins. "Because I refuse to lose you now, Clara. Not after everything we've already survived together." Clara clung to him, tears finally spilling free after months of carefully controlled composure, months of hiding fear behind forced smiles, months of believing she had to face every danger entirely alone. "I'm frightened," she whispered against his chest. "I know," William murmured into her hair. "I am too. But we'll face it together, whatever comes next." They remained locked in that embrace for a long moment, drawing strength from each other's presence, before William reluctantly pulled back his expression once again, hardening into determined resolve. "Get some rest if you can," he said. "Tomorrow we prepare for whatever Jonathan attempts next, and in 2 days we finally end this." Clara nodded, though rest felt impossibly distant with fear and adrenaline still coursing through her system. Neither of them could have anticipated that Jonathan Hale's next move wouldn't involve gunfire or fire or violence at all, but something far more insidious, an attempt to destroy Clara's credibility so thoroughly that even Judge Whitmore's legendary incorruptibility might not be enough to save her. The following morning brought a visitor Clara never expected to see again in her life. Someone whose presence would threaten to unravel everything she'd built at the Carter Ranch. Everything she'd come to believe about safety and trust, and the possibility of genuine love. Someone from her past, who knew secrets about Clara Bennett that even William didn't yet understand. The woman standing in the ranch yard wore traveling clothes coated in dust, and for one terrible moment Clara didn't recognize her at all. Then the woman lifted her chin, and Clara's whole body went rigid with shock. "Margaret." Her sister's name came out barely above a whisper. Margaret Bennett, 2 years older, sharp-eyed, and the last person on earth Clara expected to see, standing in front of the Carter Ranch, studied her with an expression Clara couldn't immediately read. Not warmth, not quite hostility either. Something guarded and complicated in between. "Hello, Clara," Margaret said. "You've led everyone quite a chase." William stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. "You know this woman." "My sister," Clara managed, still staring in disbelief. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" How did you even find me?" "Jonathan didn't send me, if that's what you're thinking," Margaret said, reading the fear in Clara's expression accurately. "I came on my own, followed the same rumors his men were chasing, only I got here using my own resources rather than his." "Why?" Clara's voice trembled between hope and suspicion. "Why would you come all this way?" Margaret's composed expression finally cracked something raw and pained flickering across her features. "Because I've spent the last year watching Jonathan Hale destroy our family, Clara. And I've spent that same year too frightened to do anything about it. When you disappeared, when Father told everyone you'd simply run off in shame, I knew that wasn't true. I knew you'd found something. Proof, maybe. Something dangerous enough that you had to flee rather than confront him directly." Clara's heart pounded. "Did Father send you to bring me back?" "Father's dead, Clara." The words landed like a physical blow. Clara staggered slightly and William's hand shot out to steady her. "Dead," Clara repeated numbly. "How?" "3 months ago," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled grief. "Officially, his heart simply gave out. Unofficially, I believe Jonathan finally squeezed hard enough that Father couldn't survive the pressure any longer. The debts, the shame, the constant threat of exposure, it broke him, Clara. Piece by piece, until there was nothing left to break." Clara pressed her hand against her mouth, tears burning behind her eyes for a father she'd left behind without proper farewell, without ever knowing these would be his final months. "I should have been there," she whispered. "You couldn't have been," Margaret said. "Jonathan would have used you against him even more thoroughly than he already did. Your absence, strangely enough, may have given Father his only remaining moment of peace, knowing at least one of his daughters had escaped Jonathan's reach." "Why are you here now, Margaret?" William asked carefully. "What do you want from Clara?" Margaret's gaze shifted to William, assessing him with the same sharp scrutiny she'd applied to Clara moments earlier. "I want to help her destroy the man who killed our father in every way that matters, even if the official cause of death protects him from direct accusation." "How?" Clara asked. "What could you possibly offer that would help?" "Testimony," Margaret said simply. "I've spent the past year documenting Jonathan's visits, his threats, his manipulation of our family's finances. I have letters he wrote to Father threatening exposure and ruin, unless certain properties were signed over. I have witnessed conversations that corroborate everything you're carrying in that evidence you stole before you left." Clara stared at her sister, hope and suspicion warring fiercely in her chest. "Why should I trust this? Why should I believe you haven't come here on Jonathan's behalf to gather information about my location and report back to him?" Margaret's expression hardened with something like genuine hurt. "Because I'm your sister Clara. Because whatever distance existed between us before you left, whatever resentments or misunderstandings, none of that matters anymore compared to seeing that monster finally answer for what he's done to our family." William watched the exchange carefully, his instincts clearly still cautious, despite Margaret's evident sincerity. "If you're telling the truth, you understand the danger you've put yourself in by coming here. Jonathan's men have already attacked this ranch twice, shot one of my hands. If they learn you're here offering testimony against him..." "I understand the risk," Margaret said firmly. "I've understood it since I decided to make this journey. I'm not asking for safety, Mr. Carter. I'm asking for the opportunity to help my sister finally end Jonathan Hale's reign of terror over our family." Clara studied her sister for a long, searching moment, the exhaustion evident in her travel-worn appearance, the genuine grief still fresh in her expression when speaking of their father's death, the fierce determination underlying every word she'd spoken. "Come inside," Clara said finally. "Let's talk properly. And Margaret," her voice caught slightly, "thank you for coming. For believing me, even from a distance." "I always believed you," Margaret said quietly. "I was simply too much a coward to act on that belief until now, but Inside the ranch house, over strong coffee, Martha provided, without asking questions. Despite her evident curiosity, Margaret laid out the full scope of what she'd documented over the past year. Correspondence proving Jonathan's systematic intimidation. Witness accounts of threatening conversations, financial records, showing exactly how he'd manipulated their family's remaining assets after Clara's departure. This is remarkable, William said, examining the documents with growing seriousness. Combined with what Clara already provided to Sheriff Morrison, this creates an overwhelming case against him. There's more, Margaret said. Something Clara doesn't know yet. Something I only recently discovered myself. Clara's stomach tightened with fresh apprehension. What is it? Margaret hesitated, glancing between Clara and William before continuing. Jonathan isn't simply defrauding our family, Clara. He's been running the same scheme across multiple families throughout the territory, forging property documents, manipulating inheritances, using threats and intimidation to silence anyone who might expose him. Our family was simply one target among many. How many? William asked sharply. At least 6 families that I've been able to document, Margaret said. Possibly more that I haven't discovered yet. He's built an entire network of corrupted officials, false documentation, and intimidated witnesses spanning nearly a decade. Clara felt sick, understanding the full scope of Jonathan's crimes with sudden horrifying clarity. That's why he's fighting so desperately to stop me. It's not simply about our family's debt or reputation. If my evidence comes to light, it threatens his entire criminal enterprise. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. Which is precisely why we need to present everything together. Your evidence, my testimony, the documented pattern across multiple families when Judge Whitmore arrives tomorrow. Tomorrow, Clara repeated, fresh anxiety flooding through her. Everything happens tomorrow. William reached across the table, taking Clara's hand, in a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past weeks. Then tonight we prepare thoroughly. Sheriff Morrison needs to know about Margaret's evidence immediately. And we need additional security tonight, more than ever, given how much is now at stake. As if summoned by William's words, Pete appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. William riders approaching, 3 of them, moving fast. Every person in the room tensed instantly. Positions, William said, already raising his voice, carrying the authority of a man who'd spent his entire life prepared for exactly this kind of danger. Margaret, stay inside with Clara and Martha. Pete, Daniel with me. William? Clara caught his arm as he moved past her. I'll be careful, he said, pressing a brief, fierce kiss to her forehead before she could protest further. Stay safe, whatever happens. He disappeared out the door with Pete and Daniel, leaving Clara, Margaret, and Martha alone in the tense silence of the kitchen. Martha's shotgun, already in hand, positioned near the window with careful vigilance. You care for him, Margaret observed quietly, watching Clara's anxious expression as she stared toward the door William had just exited. More than I ever expected to, Clara admitted. More than I believed myself capable of after everything Jonathan taught me about trust and safety. He seems like a good man, Margaret said. Different from father. Different from Jonathan, certainly. He's nothing like either of them, Clara said firmly. He's shown me more genuine kindness in 2 months than I experienced in years back home. Outside, voices carried faintly through the walls. William's steady authority. Unfamiliar voices responding with tones Clara couldn't quite identify as hostile or otherwise. The tension stretched unbearably until finally, William reappeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. It's all right, he said. Not Jonathan's men. Judge Whitmore's advance escort informing us he's arrived early, given the severity of recent events. The hearing will proceed first thing tomorrow morning in Dust Creek. Relief flooded through Clara so intensely her knees nearly buckled. Though fresh anxiety immediately followed tomorrow, everything would finally come to a head one way or another. Tomorrow, she whispered. It's finally happening tomorrow. Tomorrow. William confirmed, moving to her side, his hand finding hers with familiar, comforting warmth. Whatever happens, Clara, you won't face it alone. Margaret's testimony, Sheriff Morrison's evidence, my own account of everything Jonathan's men have done to this ranch we're bringing. Everything we have. That night passed in restless, anxious preparation. Margaret organized her documentation with meticulous care. Sheriff Morrison arrived to review the combined evidence, his expression grim with the mounting scope of Jonathan's crimes. William coordinated additional security with Pete, and the remaining hands determined that nothing would prevent Clara from reaching the courthouse safely the following morning. Clara herself found sleep utterly impossible, finally giving up entirely near midnight and making her way to the porch where she found William once again keeping vigil. Though this time, Margaret joined them, unable to sleep despite her own exhaustion. "Are you frightened?" Margaret asked quietly, settling beside Clara on the porch steps. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "Jonathan has money influence connections that extend far beyond this territory. What if Judge Whitmore's incorruptibility isn't enough? What if the evidence isn't sufficient?" "It will be," William said firmly, though Clara caught the underlying uncertainty beneath his confident tone. "Between everything you've gathered, everything Margaret's documented, everything Sheriff Morrison has witnessed regarding the violence against this ranch, no reasonable judge could ignore that combination of evidence." "Jonathan's not reasonable," Clara said. "He's calculating, patient. He'll have prepared counter-arguments, alternative explanations, perhaps even his own witnesses, willing to lie on his behalf." "Then we'll counter whatever he presents," Margaret said with fierce determination. "I've spent a year documenting his crimes specifically because I anticipated exactly this kind of resistance. He won't find easy victory tomorrow, Clara. Not against everything we're bringing." They sat together in the tense silence for a long moment, the Wyoming night stretching dark and vast around them before Clara finally spoke again. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I need you both to know how grateful I am. Margaret for finally believing me enough to act. William for offering safety to a stranger who had nothing to give in return." "You've given plenty," William said. "More than you realize. What have I given beyond danger and violence and fear?" "Purpose," William said simply. "Before you arrived, Clara, I existed on this ranch. Worked hard, maintained what my father built, avoided genuine connection, because connection had only ever brought me loss. You've given me something worth fighting for beyond simple survival. That's not nothing." Clara's breath caught emotion tightening her throat too fiercely to respond immediately. "And you," Margaret added, "have given me the courage to finally act against Jonathan Hale, rather than remaining paralyzed by fear the way I have for years. Whatever happens tomorrow, Clara, you've already succeeded in ways that matter beyond simple legal victory." The three of them remained together through the final hours before dawn, drawing strength from shared purpose and fierce determination, preparing themselves as thoroughly as possible for whatever confrontation awaited them in Dust Creek's small courthouse. Morning arrived too quickly, and not quickly enough. The entire ranch mobilizing with grim efficiency as William organized their departure for Dust Creek. Pete and Daniel rode ahead as advanced security. William, Clara, and Margaret followed in the ranch wagon, Sheriff Morrison meeting them partway with additional deputies for protection. The Dust Creek Courthouse, a modest but sturdy building at the center of town, had already drawn a considerable crowd by the time they arrived. Curious townspeople who'd heard rumors of the dramatic confrontation awaiting resolution, alongside several well-dressed strangers Clara immediately recognized as Jonathan's associates. Jonathan himself stood near the courthouse entrance, composed and confident, despite the mounting evidence against him, flanked by two lawyers whose expensive suits marked them clearly as outside legal counsel brought specifically for this confrontation. "Clara," Jonathan said, as she approached, his voice carrying that same smooth, controlled quality that had always terrified her more than open hostility. "And Margaret, how unexpected. I hadn't realized you'd finally worked up sufficient courage to abandon your father's memory so thoroughly." "Don't speak of father," Margaret said sharply, her composure cracking with fresh grief and fury. "Not after what you did to him. I did nothing to your father beyond what any reasonable businessman would do when debts remain unpaid," Jonathan said calmly. "His unfortunate passing was simply the natural consequence of age and stress, nothing more sinister than that." "We'll let Judge Whitmore determine what's natural and what's manufactured," William said coldly, positioning himself protectively beside Clara as they entered the courthouse. Inside, Judge Harrison Whitmore proved exactly as formidable as his reputation suggested, an older man with sharp assessing eyes and an expression that revealed nothing of his eventual judgment, as he reviewed the assembled evidence with meticulous attention. The hearing began with Sheriff Morrison's account of the escalating violence against the Carter Ranch, followed by Doc Reeves's testimony regarding Tommy's shooting, establishing clearly documented criminal violence connected directly to Jonathan Hale's associates. Then Clara herself took the stand, her hands trembling despite her determination to remain composed, presenting the evidence she'd carried across 1,000 miles at considerable personal risk. Forged documents, manipulated ledgers, correspondence proving systematic fraud against her family, and as Margaret's additional testimony revealed numerous other families throughout the region. Jonathan's lawyers attempted repeatedly to discredit her testimony, suggesting instability, questioning her credibility as an unmarried woman traveling alone, implying romantic motivations behind her accusations given her evident relationship with William Carter. "Miss Bennett," one lawyer said, with barely concealed condescension, "isn't it true that your accusations against my client conveniently coincide with your own personal interest in avoiding an arranged marriage you found undesirable?" "My accusations coincide with documented evidence of fraud, forgery, and criminal intimidation," Clara replied, her voice gaining strength despite her nervousness. "Evidence that exists independent of any personal feelings I might hold regarding arranged marriage. And your relationship with Mr. Carter here," the lawyer continued, gesturing toward William. "Wouldn't that suggest personal motivation to fabricate accusations against my client, perhaps to secure your position within Mr. Carter's household?" "Objection," Sheriff Morrison interjected sharply. "Counsel is attempting character assassination rather than addressing documented evidence." "Sustained," Judge Whitmore said firmly. "Counsel will confine questioning to relevant evidence, not speculation, regarding Miss Bennett's personal relationships." The hearing continued for hours, Margaret's testimony corroborating Clara's accusations with devastating precision. Additional witnesses Sheriff Morrison had located throughout the morning, confirming Jonathan's pattern of fraud across multiple families. The accumulated weight of evidence, growing increasingly difficult for Jonathan's lawyers to counter despite their evident skill. Finally, Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess before delivering his judgment, and Clara found herself standing outside the courthouse with William, Margaret, and Sheriff Morrison, exhausted but cautiously hopeful. "The evidence is overwhelming," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "I don't see how Judge Whitmore could rule anything except in your favor, Miss Bennett." "Jonathan's lawyers are skilled," Clara said nervously. "They've clearly prepared extensively for this confrontation." "Skill doesn't overcome documented fraud," William said firmly, his hand finding hers with steady reassurance. "Whatever happens next, Clara, you've already accomplished something remarkable today. You stood before that courtroom and spoke truth to power, regardless of the outcome." As they waited for the recess to end, Jonathan approached them directly, his composed expression finally showing cracks of genuine concern beneath the surface calm. "Clara," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure privacy before continuing, "perhaps we might discuss alternative resolution before Judge Whitmore returns. I'm prepared to offer considerable compensation sufficient to secure your future comfortably in exchange for withdrawing these accusations." "You're offering me a bribe?" Clara said, disbelief and fury coloring her voice. "After everything you've done to my family, to countless others, to the people at Williams Ranch, who nearly died because of your violence, you believe money can simply resolve this?" "I believe reasonable people can always find mutually beneficial resolution," Jonathan said, though his composed facade was clearly cracking under mounting pressure. "Consider carefully, Clara, whether pursuing this confrontation to its conclusion truly serves your interests, or whether accepting reasonable compensation might prove wiser." "My interests," Clara said coldly, "involve seeing justice served for everyone you've harmed, Jonathan, not accepting bribes to protect your criminal enterprise." Jonathan's expression darkened, the careful mask finally slipping entirely to reveal something colder and more dangerous beneath. "You're making a significant mistake, Clara. One you may come to regret considerably." "The only mistake," William interjected sharply, stepping between them, "was believing you could threaten and manipulate your way out of consequences for your crimes indefinitely." Before Jonathan could respond further, the courthouse bell signaled the recess's end, and they filed back inside, tension crackling through the air as Judge Whitmore prepared to deliver his judgment. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Whitmore reviewed his notes one final time, his expression giving away nothing of his conclusion. Having reviewed the extensive evidence presented today, he began finally, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, including documented forgery, systematic fraud, and criminal intimidation spanning multiple families throughout this territory, alongside direct evidence of violence perpetrated against the Carter Ranch. In apparent retaliation for these proceedings, this court finds overwhelming cause to proceed with criminal charges against Jonathan Hale. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Clara felt her knees nearly buckle with overwhelming relief. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, given the severity of documented violence, including the shooting of an innocent young man in an apparent attempt to intimidate witnesses, this court orders Jonathan Hale held without bail pending full criminal trial, with additional charges to be filed regarding conspiracy to commit violence against Carter Ranch personnel. Jonathan's composed facade shattered completely, fury and disbelief warring across his features as sheriff's deputies moved to take him into custody. "This isn't over," he snarled toward Clara as deputies escorted him from the courtroom. "You'll regret this, Clara. All of you will." "Get him out of my courtroom," Judge Whitmore said coldly, and the deputies complied swiftly, leaving Jonathan's threats echoing uselessly behind him. The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs and scattered applause as the full weight of what had just occurred settled over everyone present. Clara turned to find William watching her with an expression of fierce pride and overwhelming relief, Margaret beside him with tears streaming freely down her face. "It's over," Clara whispered, barely able to believe the words even as she spoke them. "It's actually over." "It's over," William confirmed, pulling her into a fierce embrace that Clara sank into, completely, months of accumulated fear and tension finally beginning to release. But even as relief flooded through her, Clara understood that surviving Jonathan's legal defeat represented only the beginning of rebuilding everything that had been shattered: her family's reputation, her sense of safety, and the complicated, precious relationship that had grown between herself and William Carter across these dangerous, transformative months. Whatever came next, Clara understood with growing certainty that she would face it not as the frightened, abandoned woman who'd arrived at Dust Creek's train depot months earlier, but as someone who had finally learned to fight for herself and who had found in the most unexpected circumstances imaginable a place and people worth fighting for. The relief lasted exactly 11 days. Clara was hanging fresh linens on the line behind the house when Pete came riding hard from town. His horse lathered his face white as chalk. "William!" he shouted, nearly falling from the saddle. "William, get out here now!" William came from the barn at a dead run, and Clara dropped the linens entirely, her heart already climbing into her throat. "What's happened?" William demanded. "Jonathan's lawyers." Pete gasped, still catching his breath. "They filed something with the territorial court in Cheyenne. An appeal or a countersuit. I don't rightly understand the legal language, but Sheriff Morrison says it's serious. Says Jonathan's claiming the evidence was obtained illegally. Says Clara stole those documents, which technically she did, and his lawyers are arguing that makes everything inadmissible." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "That's absurd," Margaret said, appearing in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "The evidence proves his crimes regardless of how it was obtained." "Sheriff Morrison says the territorial judge might see it different," Pete said grimly. "Says property law's tricky that way. Jonathan's arguing Clara had no legal right to those documents in the first place, which means everything built on top of them might be compromised." William's jaw tightened to the point of visible strain. "He's out on bail already." "Judge Whitmore held him without bail," Pete confirmed. "But this new filing goes over Whitmore's head straight to the territorial court. If they rule in Jonathan's favor, Sheriff Morrison says the original conviction could be overturned entirely. Man could walk free within the month." Clara's knees buckled, and William caught her before she could fall, his arm firm and steady around her waist. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "We won. Judge Whitmore ruled in our favor." Jonathan's not the kind of man who accepts defeat, William said grimly. We should have anticipated he'd fight through every possible legal avenue. What do we do? Clara asked, panic rising sharp and cold in her chest. We fight back, Margaret said fiercely. We get ahead of this before it reaches the territorial court. Sheriff Morrison arrived within the hour, his expression as grim as Pete had described, carrying a thick envelope of legal documents that he spread across the kitchen table with careful precision. Jonathan's lawyers are skilled, he admitted. They've found a genuine weakness in how the evidence was obtained. Legally speaking, Clara did commit theft when she took those documents from Jonathan's possession, regardless of the fact that the documents themselves prove his crimes. So a technicality could free a man who ordered violence against innocent people. William's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Not if we're smart about how we respond, Sheriff Morrison said. The territorial court hearing is scheduled for 8 days from now in Cheyenne. We need additional evidence obtained through entirely legal means that doesn't depend on Clara's original documents at all. Where would we find that? Clara asked, desperation edging into her voice. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her expression troubled. Finally, she spoke. There's someone else. Someone I haven't mentioned because I wasn't certain she'd be willing to help. Who? William asked. Eleanor Whitfield, Margaret said. Jonathan's former bookkeeper. She quit her position 8 months ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. I've heard rumors she left because she discovered something troubling in his accounts, but she's been too frightened to come forward directly. Where is she now? Sheriff Morrison asked. Living with relatives in Laramie as far as I know, Margaret said. If we could convince her to testify to provide legitimate financial records she witnessed directly during her employment, that would constitute evidence entirely independent of what Clara originally took. 8 days, William said. Laramie's nearly a week's journey round trip if the weather holds. Then we need to leave immediately, Clara said, new determination, steadying her voice despite the fear still coursing through her veins. Not you, William said firmly. It's too dangerous, Clara. Jonathan's men could still be watching for exactly this kind of opportunity to intercept you while you're traveling. I won't hide while everyone else fights this battle for me, Clara said, matching his firmness with her own. This is my fight, William. It's always been my fight. It's ours now, William corrected gently. But that doesn't mean I'm willing to risk losing you to some ambush on an open road, not when we're this close to finally ending Jonathan's threat permanently. They argued for the better part of an hour, Clara insisting on accompanying the journey to Laramie. William equally insistent on her remaining at the ranch under heavy protection, until Sheriff Morrison finally interrupted with a compromise. I'll travel to Laramie myself with Margaret to help identify and convince Miss Whitfield, he said. William, you stay here and maintain security at the ranch in case Jonathan attempts anything further while we're away. Clara stays protected here as well. We'll return within 6 days, hopefully, with Eleanor Whitfield and legitimate evidence in hand. Clara wanted to protest further, every instinct screaming against passive waiting, while others fought on her behalf, but the practical wisdom of the plan was undeniable. All right, she said finally reluctantly. But please be careful. Both of you. Margaret embraced her fiercely before departing. We'll bring back everything we need to finally end this, Clara. I promise you that. The 6 days that followed proved the longest of Clara's life. She threw herself into ranch work with desperate intensity, trying to occupy her mind against the constant gnawing fear that something might go wrong, that Sheriff Morrison and Margaret might encounter Jonathan's men on the road, that Eleanor Whitfield might refuse to testify, that the territorial court might rule against them, regardless of whatever additional evidence they managed to gather. William remained a steady, constant presence throughout those anxious days, though Clara noticed him watching her with increasing concern as her composure gradually frayed under the accumulated stress. You need to rest, he told her on the 4th evening, finding her still awake near midnight, mending clothes with fierce, unnecessary concentration. You've barely slept all week. I can't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong, Clara admitted, setting aside her mending with trembling hands. What if this technicality truly does free him, William? What if everything we've survived, everything Tommy suffered, everything your ranch has endured amounts to nothing in the end? William sat beside her, taking her hands in his own steady grip. Then we'll fight through whatever comes next exactly as we've fought through everything else. But Clara, whatever happens with the legal proceedings, I need you to understand something important. What? You're not defined by whether Jonathan Hale faces justice or escapes it, William said quietly. You're defined by your own strength, your own resilience, the courage you've shown throughout this entire ordeal. If somehow he manages to escape consequences through legal technicalities, that doesn't diminish anything you've already accomplished. It feels like it would, Clara whispered. It feels like everything would have been for nothing. It wouldn't be for nothing, William said firmly. Because regardless of legal outcomes, you'd still be free of him, Clara. Free to build whatever life you choose, wherever you choose to build it. That freedom itself is worth everything you've sacrificed to achieve it. Clara studied him in the dim lamplight, drawing strength from his steady presence from the fierce conviction underlying his words. William, she said softly, these past months, despite everything, the fear, the violence, the uncertainty, I've never once regretted walking away from that train depot with you. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that. Something shifted in William's expression, raw and unguarded in a way Clara had rarely seen from him. Clara, I've been waiting for the right moment to say something, but I'm beginning to think there may never be a perfectly safe, uncomplicated moment given everything we're facing. So I'll simply say it now. Clara's heart began pounding with sudden, breathless anticipation. I love you, William said simply. I've loved you for weeks now, possibly longer than I've been willing to admit even to myself. I love your strength, your resilience, the way you've faced impossible danger without ever losing your fundamental decency and courage. Whatever happens with Jonathan Hale, whatever the future holds, I want to face it with you beside me, not simply as someone under my protection, but as someone I hope might choose to build a life alongside me permanently. Tears spilled freely down Clara's cheeks, months of accumulated fear and hope and complicated emotion finally breaking free entirely. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since that very first night when you offered me safety without demanding anything in return. I was simply too frightened to acknowledge it, too certain that trusting anyone would eventually lead to betrayal. And now, William asked softly, now I understand that trust. Real trust doesn't have to lead to betrayal, Clara said. Not when it's built with someone as honorable as you. William leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that carried months of careful restraint, accumulated tension, and genuine overwhelming love, finally allowed to surface without hesitation. Clara melted into it, into him, feeling something fundamental settling into place within her chest, for the first time since fleeing her hometown with stolen evidence and desperate hope. They remained together long into that night, speaking softly of futures they hadn't previously allowed themselves to imagine, of possibilities beyond simple survival against Jonathan's threat of the life they might build together once this final legal battle finally reached its conclusion. Sheriff Morrison and Margaret returned on the 6th day, exhausted from hard travel, but carrying with them exactly what they'd hoped to find Eleanor Whitfield herself, a nervous but determined woman in her 30s, along with a collection of financial records she'd secretly copied before leaving Jonathan's employment. She witnessed everything, Margaret said, exhaustion evident in her voice despite obvious relief. Watched Jonathan falsify records for years, threatened into silence by fear of losing her position and reputation. When we explained the situation, explained what you'd already risked to expose him, she agreed to testify. Eleanor herself looked terrified, but resolute. I should have come forward months ago, she admitted. I was simply too frightened of what Jonathan might do if I spoke against him directly. But learning what happened to that young man on your ranch, learning how far Jonathan's willing to go to silence witnesses, I couldn't remain silent any longer. Thank you, Clara said, taking Eleanor's trembling hands in her own, for finding the courage to help despite everything you're risking. We're running out of time, Sheriff Morrison said grimly. The territorial hearing is in 2 days. We need to travel to Cheyenne immediately if we're going to present this evidence properly." The journey to Cheyenne passed in tense, watchful silence, William and Pete providing armed escort alongside Sheriff Morrison's deputies. Everyone acutely aware that Jonathan's associates might attempt one final desperate intervention before the hearing could proceed. They arrived without incident, though the tension never fully eased, settling into a modest hotel near the territorial courthouse to prepare for the following day's crucial proceedings. That evening, as Clara reviewed Eleanor's documentation alongside Margaret and Sheriff Morrison, a knock at their hotel room door sent fresh alarm through everyone present. William answered cautiously, rifle within easy reach, only to reveal Edmund Cross standing in the hallway, his expensive coat replaced by something considerably more modest, his composed confidence noticeably diminished. "What do you want?" William demanded. 5 minutes of Miss Bennet's time," Cross said. "I'm no longer working for Jonathan Hale, if that concerns you. I resigned my position 3 days ago after learning the full extent of what he's done, what he ordered done to that young man at your ranch." Clara approached cautiously, studying Cross's expression for any sign of deception. "Why should we trust you?" "You shouldn't entirely," Cross admitted. "But I've brought something that might prove useful regardless of whether you trust my motivations. Records of every payment Jonathan made to men he hired for unofficial business, including the men who attacked your ranch who shot that boy." He extended a leather folio toward Clara, who accepted it with trembling hands, opening it to reveal exactly what he'd described: detailed financial records connecting Jonathan directly to the violence perpetrated against the Carter Ranch. "Why give us this now?" Margaret asked suspiciously. "Because I have limits," Cross said quietly. "I was willing to intimidate, to threaten, even to apply considerable pressure through legal means. But shooting an innocent boy, nearly killing him, simply to silence witnesses that exceeded whatever moral flexibility I'd convinced myself I possessed. I won't testify directly. I've no wish to face Jonathan's retribution myself, but these records should prove useful regardless." He departed before anyone could respond further, disappearing into the Cheyenne evening as quietly as he'd arrived. "This changes everything," Sheriff Morrison said, reviewing the documents with growing seriousness. "Direct evidence connecting Jonathan financially to the violence against your ranch, combined with Eleanor's testimony regarding his systematic fraud, combined with Margaret's original documentation, this should overwhelm whatever technical arguments his lawyers attempt to raise." Clara felt cautious hope flickering back to life, despite the accumulated exhaustion and fear of recent days. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Tomorrow, we finally end this permanently." The territorial courthouse proved considerably grander than Dust Creek's modest building, and the presiding judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Constance Reeves, listened to the presented arguments with careful, unbiased attention as both sides prepared their final arguments. Jonathan's lawyers argued forcefully regarding the illegally obtained nature of Clara's original evidence, insisting that regardless of what those documents revealed, their improper acquisition rendered the entire case fundamentally compromised. "Miss Bennett committed theft," the lead lawyer argued. "Regardless of her motivations, regardless of what she believed those documents proved the fundamental illegality of their acquisition taints everything built upon that foundation." "Your Honor," Sheriff Morrison countered, "while Miss Bennett's original acquisition of documents may indeed constitute technical theft, this court now possesses entirely independent evidence testimony from Mr. Hale's former bookkeeper regarding systematic fraud. She witnessed directly, and financial records provided voluntarily by a former associate connecting Mr. Hale directly to violent attacks against innocent civilians." Eleanor Whitfield took the stand next, her voice trembling initially, but growing steadier as she detailed years of witnessing Jonathan's fraudulent practices, his systematic manipulation of vulnerable families' finances, his threats against anyone who questioned his methods. "I watched him forge signatures on property documents," Eleanor testified. "I watched him threaten witnesses into silence. I remained silent myself for years out of fear for my own safety and reputation, but I can no longer allow that fear to protect a man capable of such calculated cruelty." Jonathan's composed facade, which had held remarkably steady throughout the morning's proceedings, finally began cracking visibly as Eleanor's testimony painted an increasingly damning portrait of his systematic criminality. Then Sheriff Morrison presented Edmund Cross's financial records, connecting Jonathan directly to payments made to the men who'd attacked the Carter Ranch, shot Tommy, and burned the fence line in escalating attempts at intimidation.
These records, Sheriff Morrison stated firmly, demonstrate conclusively that Mr. Hale personally financed violent attacks against innocent civilians in an attempt to suppress legitimate evidence of his crimes. This evidence exists entirely independent of anything Miss Bennett originally acquired, and it demonstrates a clear ongoing pattern of criminal behavior extending well beyond simple property fraud. Judge Reeves reviewed each piece of evidence with meticulous attention, her expression giving away nothing of her eventual conclusion as the hours passed and both sides presented their final arguments. Finally, as afternoon light began slanting long through the courthouse windows, Judge Reeves called for order and prepared to deliver her judgment. This court has carefully considered the arguments presented regarding the legality of Miss Bennett's original evidence acquisition. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the tense, silent courtroom. While questions regarding that specific evidence's admissibility remain legitimately complex, this court finds that entirely independent evidence, specifically Miss Whitfield's direct testimony, and the financial records connecting Mr. Hale to violence against Carter Ranch personnel, provides more than sufficient grounds to uphold the original conviction. Clara's breath caught hope surging fierce and overwhelming through her chest. Furthermore, Judge Reeves continued, given the additional evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice through violence and intimidation, this court finds cause to enhance the original sentencing considerably. Mr. Hale will face not only the original charges of fraud and forgery, but additional charges of conspiracy to commit violence, attempted murder in connection with the shooting of Thomas Reeves, and obstruction of justice. Jonathan's composure shattered completely, fury and disbelief warring across his features as the full weight of the enhanced judgment settled over the courtroom. "This is an outrage," he snarled, rising from his seat, despite his lawyer's attempts to restrain him. "You cannot possibly believe the testimony of a frightened former employee and financial records that could easily be fabricated." "Mr. Hale," Judge Reeves said coldly, "you will remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom immediately. This court has reviewed extensive credible evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of criminal behavior spanning years and multiple victims. Your objections have been duly noted and duly dismissed." Deputies moved to restrain Jonathan as his fury finally overwhelmed his careful composure entirely. "Clara!" he shouted across the courtroom, his voice carrying desperate venom. "This isn't finished. I have resources connections beyond this territory's reach. You'll regret this for the rest of your—" "Remove him," Judge Reeves ordered sharply, and deputies dragged Jonathan from the courtroom despite his continued shouting, his threats finally rendered powerless against the overwhelming weight of justice, finally catching up with his years of calculated cruelty. The courtroom fell into stunned, relieved silence as the full reality of what had just occurred settled over everyone present. Clara turned to find William watching her with fierce pride and overwhelming relief, tears streaming freely down both their faces. "It's finished," she whispered. "It's actually truly finished." "It's finished," William confirmed, pulling her into an embrace that Clara sank into, completely years of accumulated fear and danger finally beginning to release entirely from her exhausted body. Margaret embraced them both, tears mixing with genuine, overwhelming joy. "Father would be proud," she whispered. "Finally, justice for everything Jonathan took from our family." Eleanor Whitfield approached hesitantly, still visibly shaken from testifying, but clearly relieved as well. "Thank you," she said to Clara, "for giving me the courage to finally speak against him." "Thank you," Clara replied, embracing the woman who'd risked everything to help secure justice, "for finding that courage when it mattered most."
They returned to the Carter Ranch 3 days later, exhausted, but genuinely finally at peace for the first time since Clara's arrival months earlier. The ranch hands greeted them with genuine celebration, Martha preparing an elaborate feast to mark the occasion, Tommy fully recovered from his shoulder wound, leading enthusiastic toasts to justice finally served. "To Miss Clara," Pete announced, raising his glass. "Bravest woman I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and the reason justice finally caught up with a man who thought himself untouchable." "To William," Clara countered, raising her own glass toward him, "who offered safety to a stranger without demanding anything in return, and who never once wavered in protecting what he believed was right, regardless of personal cost." The celebration continued long into the evening. Laughter and relief and genuine joy filling the ranch house in a way Clara hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Later, after the celebration had wound down and most had retired for the evening, Clara found herself alone on the porch with William staring out at the same darkened fields that had once represented uncertain danger, now representing something entirely different, home safety belonging. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Margaret needs to return home eventually to manage whatever remains of our family's affairs. Eleanor will need to rebuild her own life, free from Jonathan's influence at last." "And you?" William asked quietly. "What do you want, Clara, now that you're finally free of the danger that shaped these past months?" Clara considered the question carefully, studying William's steady, hopeful expression in the moonlight. "I want to stay," she said finally. "Here at this ranch with you, if you'll still have me now that the danger's past, and there's no longer any practical necessity requiring your protection." William's expression softened with profound relief and joy. "Clara, I never offered you protection out of practical necessity alone. I offered it because somewhere between that first evening at the depot and now you became essential to my own happiness, my own sense of purpose. Then perhaps," Clara said, her heart pounding with hopeful anticipation, "we might consider making that arrangement more permanent." William's eyes widened slightly before understanding dawned, and he reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box he'd apparently been carrying for considerably longer than Clara realized. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he admitted, kneeling before her with a mixture of nervousness and fierce determination. "Clara Bennett, would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife? Not out of necessity or protection, but out of genuine love and the desire to build a life together, regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring." Tears spilled freely down Clara's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the overwhelming emotion tightening her throat. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, William, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into a fierce, joyful embrace. Both of them laughing through tears as months of accumulated fear and danger finally transformed into pure, unrestrained happiness. Martha, apparently watching from the kitchen window, let out a whoop of delight that brought the remaining ranch hands rushing back outside to witness the celebration. Fresh toasts raised to the newly engaged couple amid genuine, overwhelming joy. Said. They married 6 weeks later in a modest ceremony held right there at the Carter Ranch, surrounded by the people who had fought alongside them through danger and violence to reach this moment of genuine happiness. Margaret stood as Clara's attendant, having decided to remain in Wyoming territory rather than return to a hometown forever tainted by painful memories. Eleanor Whitfield attended as well, having found employment managing accounts for several ranches throughout the region, finally free to build a life unburdened by fear. Pete gave a toast that had the entire gathering laughing through happy tears, recounting with exaggerated drama the first evening William had returned from Dust Creek with a mysterious woman he'd found wandering the train platform. "Never seen William so thoroughly undone by anything in all my years knowing him," Pete announced, raising his glass toward the newly married couple. Took one look at Miss Clara, and something in him just knew plain as day that his life was about to change permanently and for the better. As the celebration continued long into the evening, Clara found herself standing beside William on the same porch where he'd first offered her protection months earlier, where they'd shared countless anxious vigils awaiting Jonathan's next attack, where William had finally confessed his love, despite the danger still surrounding them both. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. Standing at that depot, reading Thomas Whitfield's cowardly letter, believing my entire life had just collapsed into nothing. "I remember," William said, pulling her close against him. "Remember thinking you looked like someone the world had failed rather thoroughly, and feeling compelled to offer whatever help I could, without fully understanding why it mattered so intensely. I remember believing that letter represented the end of every hope I'd carried west," Clara said. "Instead, it became the beginning of everything that actually mattered. Finding you, finding genuine safety, finally learning that trust doesn't always lead to betrayal. Sometimes," William said quietly, echoing sentiments he'd expressed months earlier during their most frightening days. "Losing something we believed essential becomes the very thing that leads us towards something infinitely more valuable." Clara smiled, genuine and unguarded, studying her husband's face in the gathering evening light. "Thomas Whitfield's cowardice led me directly to you," she said. "I find myself strangely enough almost grateful for his abandonment now." "As am I," William said, kissing her gently. "Though I suspect fate would have found some other way to bring us together regardless, given how thoroughly you've become essential to my own happiness." They stood together on that porch as darkness settled fully over the Wyoming prairie celebration, continuing warmly behind them. Danger and violence, finally permanently resolved, replaced entirely by genuine love and hard-won belonging. Clara Bennett. No. Clara Carter now understood with complete unwavering certainty that she had finally found exactly what she'd been searching for since childhood, since long before Thomas Whitfield's cowardly betrayal, since long before Jonathan Hale's calculated cruelty had nearly destroyed everything she held dear. She had found home. Not simply a physical place, though. The Carter Ranch had certainly become that. Not simply safety, though she'd fought fiercely alongside William and Margaret, and everyone else who'd risked everything to secure that safety permanently. She had found genuine belonging, the profound, unshakable knowledge that she was valued, respected, and deeply loved, not despite her strength and independence, but precisely because of it. Jonathan Hale would spend the remainder of his days facing the consequences of his crimes, his considerable resources and influence finally proven insufficient against determined justice and courageous testimony. Thomas Whitfield's cowardly abandonment had long since faded into insignificance, a distant memory overshadowed entirely by the genuine love and partnership Clara had found instead. And Clara Carter, standing beside her husband on the porch of the ranch that had become her true home, understood with complete certainty the profound truth she would carry with her for the remainder of her life. Sometimes the darkest moments of abandonment become the very foundation upon which the most extraordinary happiness is built, not because the pain itself held any inherent value, but because surviving it, fighting through it, revealed a strength and resilience that could never have been discovered any other way. She had walked away from that train depot believing herself utterly alone, utterly abandoned, utterly without value or purpose. She had found instead everything that truly mattered, and that she understood completely was not simply good fortune or fate. That was the unshakable truth of a woman who had refused to let abandonment define her worth and who had found in the process a love strong enough to last a lifetime.